Hello there, and welcome to a DF Direct special, which is going to be concerning our hands-on experience with the Nintendo Switch 2 at the recent London event. And it's kind of interesting, this, because obviously we've already talked extensively about Switch 2. We've had access to a big bunch of assets. So how can we add to that? Well, I guess the hands-on experience is, basically of crucial importance, but it is going to be quite different to what we've already discussed already. And we'll try not to repeat the material too much. Joining me, first of all, the guy who joined me at London, Tom Morgan. Hello.
Yes, Rich, not too long since we were last together at the event. It's good to be back and talk about what we saw there.
Absolutely. And of course, Digital Foundry's resident Switch enthusiast, Mackenzie.
Yes, Rich, we're here to talk about your hands-on impressions and my less valuable hands-off impressions today.
Well, yes, but you are indeed our Switch 2 enthusiast. How many games do you actually have at this point for your Switch?
450 or so, probably.
Wow.
Oh boy.
Quite a few, yeah.
Amazing. Okay, so we've got a lot to get through here. We didn't actually see all of the games. We didn't have time. We had a limited 4-hour window and there was a lot to see. But, obviously we targeted the stuff we wanted to see. And I guess we should kick off by talking about the hardware. Okay, so Nintendo Switch 2 hardware. Full disclosure here, all of the games were being demonstrated on development hardware. And it was pointed out to us that in terms of like handling the unit, stuff like that, showing you, the form factor of the machine, there are slight differences between the development unit and the final retail machine. However, at the end of the main hall, you could actually go hands-on with a retail unit. And obviously we got some footage of that. But where do we begin? I think, Tom, we should start by talking about the form factor, the size of the thing, because This is really interesting from my perspective. Obviously, when you first go hands-on with the Steam Deck with its big sort of grips and whatnot, there's the sense that this is it is a handheld machine, but perhaps more a portable machine. There's a certain weight and heft to it. And I don't know about you, but I didn't... It's weird because you'll see the size comparisons and it is indeed kind of like Steam Deck class. But in the hand, it feels like a slightly larger Switch, but it doesn't feel like this sort of big hulking device that the kind of PC handhelds have sort of evolved into. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, the most remarkable thing about it is how unremarkable it is in the hand.
Right.
It just doesn't actually register that you're playing a new console at some point. You feel the size of it. In terms of the area you've got your hands, you're able to put your hands across, and the size of the buttons, the size of the new analog sticks, that's all felt, I think. But even, jumping backwards and forwards between the old and, the new Switch 2 unit, you're actually just you're not really getting, it doesn't quite register that there's a jump there. Mm-hmm. So it maybe speaks to a great extent how Nintendo knocked out of the park first time around in 2017 with the original design, that we're so familiar with that design, and that ultimately Nintendo wanted to stick to this layout and only needed to refine a couple of bits about the handheld itself. Mm-hmm. Yeah. In terms of I did get a go, as you say, with the actual unit. There was only a kind of an exhibition booth right at the back for people who really wanted to have a go without any power going through it.
Right.
This is just a dumb unit where you can take the Joy-Cons off, clack them back on. And there wasn't really very much to it besides that. It was like 20 seconds and you're done. Clack, clack. It refines some elements and addresses a couple of issues where there were. One of them was the Joy-Con attachments for the original Switch. Not a bother for me, but there was obviously some give. There was some millimeters worth of give on either side, which caused some wiggle when you hold it. That's gone. That's completely... the margin is completely removed to make it a watertight, reassuring hold on either side. Made all the more reassuring by the fact there is actually an unlock button, of course, at the back of each Joy-Con. And you can pull it away. I think, it's necessary to have those buttons, but the magnetic hold is strong enough that for most people, I don't think you would have even been able to wrench it off accidentally in most scenarios. So yeah, the Joy-Cons feel very sturdy, very robust, and that's really one of the key issues I think I had with the original Switch.
Let's talk about the screen. Yeah, we actually went into this with a bit of a plan. Obviously, we knew that The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild would be there in its enhanced form. And we thought to ourselves, well, why not take an original Switch unit and the OLED model and run the same content side by side with the Switch 2. And we set up this elaborate shot, which we thought would be a bit of a game changer, but it turns out that the varying angles on the screens means that we're going to need to do this again a bit more scientifically at some point. But yeah, you can see the comparison rolling out here. I think, from my perspective, we kind of got the best angle on the OG Switch here, which kind of like shows it punching above its weight somewhat compared to the Switch 2, which is considerably more bright, vibrant, a lot more contrast there. And obviously there is an HDR effect. I'm not sure I'm hugely convinced with it on Zelda, assuming it is actually running in HDR. But I think the comparison here that's kind of sold the most short is the OLED model, where the contrast from OLED is still completely unmatchable. It's a significant improvement over Switch 2. But that's not to say that the Switch 2 screen is actually in any way bad. I think it's actually really fantastic for an LCD. And it's particularly great in titles that really do pop, like Mario Kart World. That was just quite an experience handheld. That was quite an interesting experience. I also like the fact that it's a bigger screen, particularly when you get older. You kind of need a bigger screen, just with the way what happens to eyeballs as you get older. I really appreciated that. Let's just say that. Ultimately, I don't really have any sort of. I only used the development unit. I didn't go with the retail hands-on like you did. But it does feel just like a slightly larger Switch. If you're perfectly okay with your current Switch, you just all of that sort of muscle memory ports over to the new unit. It's bigger, but I didn't feel it was in any way unwieldy. I kind of like the Steam Deck with those grips because, it kind of does make it easier to hold. But at the same time, the Switch 2 evolution of the original, tried and tested, bigger screen, I liked it. You're right, there is a certain degree of, I'd just say that the sticks feel better. I just don't really have any complaints about it whatsoever. One thing I did not appreciate so much about the original Switch is that when you're playing for hours, the kind of thin nature of the Joy-Cons really digs into your palms. Maybe that would be an issue on this one, but ultimately it is indeed a Switch 2.
Yeah.
Oliver?
One thing I actually really do like about that super slim design, though, is that because it is so thin and really just made about as thick as it needs to be, you can put a case of your choosing on it. So, for instance, I have a Switch 2 case right here, even though the device is not yet with us. I have a very early Switch 2 case which has some grips on the back. Looks like it'll be pretty comfortable. This is how I use my Switch unit, with grips and thumb caps to hopefully improve that travel and give me a little bit more of that grip. And that's one thing. On the Steam Deck, you don't really have the option. Like, if you don't love this feel of those grips completely, if you'd prefer even a grip that extends beyond the base of the unit, more like a traditional controller, you can't get that. Whereas on Switch, you do have that customizability, so I quite like that. In terms of the general hardware here, it's been detailed so extensively over the past few months. We've basically had accurate CAD drawings since September of last year, so there's no real surprises in either this showcase or indeed Nintendo's earlier showcases where they've shown off the hardware. It's very much something that we've basically expected every single function on the device except for the C button, which they only detailed 2 weeks ago. But it does look pretty sleek here. I think keeping the depth of the unit the same while increasing its overall area and size and screen size makes it look a little bit more svelte and a little bit more modern looking there. My only real concern here is possibly the kickstand, which doesn't look as good as the OLED's unit's kickstand, which is like a pure flat plane of rectangular metal. Here it's kind of a U-shaped stand. I imagine maybe you could bend it, twist it slightly if you put torsion on it in the right angles, but it definitely looks much better than the original Switch's kickstand, which, if you recall, was like that little tiny sliver of plastic that didn't really support the unit very well. So this is probably going to be at least a reasonably stable kickstand in typical use. Just judging from the footage here, I think the Switch 2 screen might become a little bit of a disappointment for people who are coming from a SWOLED. but I think it does look better than the OG Switch model here. But if you look side by side, there's one comparison that you guys did that I thought was kind of interesting, where you're looking at a black screen in Breath of the Wild, and the SWOLED screen is pitch black. The Switch 2 screen is clearly somewhat grayer, right, but not too bad. And the Switch 1 screen is quite gray, although I'm not sure. The Switch 1 screen is at a very extreme angle, so I'm not sure if you're getting some IPS glow there. I'd really kind of discount that in this comparison. I'd look more at the other two units. And there you are clearly seeing the effects of an LCD edge-lit backlight with either IPS or LTPS technology potentially there, as opposed to the OLED blacks on the SWOLED, which is a quite nice feature of it. Unfortunately, you're going to be missing out on here on the Switch 2. But historically speaking, the Switch LCDs have not been very good in terms of brightness, in terms of color reproduction. They were fine for LCD panels, IPS LCD panels, but they were not nearly as good as OLED panels, which started shipping during a similar period, like in 2016, 2017 for the original Switch unit. There were very many OLED panels and cell phones during that period, and that was certainly a bit of a letdown. Of course, that was rectified a little bit with the Switch OLED, which had a pretty decent quality OLED panel there. But it's kind of hard to tell in this captured footage exactly how much of an upgrade that screen is. But I do trust that with the HDR support, with the VRR support, with 120 hertz support, with possibly some upgrades to contrast and brightness, it probably is a noticeably better feeling screen in person, if not quite to that same level in every respect as the Switch OLED. I'd have to assume that's probably true.
Yeah. We should talk a lot about HDR actually, because yes, an edge-lit LCD is not ideal conditions for an HDR panel, and certainly up against the kind of wow factor you get from a Steam Deck OLED, it's that wow factor just isn't really there. So I'd consider it, well, Steam Deck OLED was a game changer. This I'd consider more of an enhancement, a welcome enhancement, and it's particularly effective on certain content. Cyberpunk 2077 handheld at night with the neon lights, there is a genuine sense that you're getting something HDR-like. However, with other content, it's kind of like, okay, this is just a really nice screen, as opposed to, oh, wow, this is like an HDR game changer. You don't really get that, and I think that's okay. Obviously, I think further on down the line, once, I think there is an availability issue with an OLED screen that supports 120 hertz, that is 1080p, and supports VRR. I'm not sure that technology is actually out there yet, but it may not be the case that it was available to Nintendo anyway, but may well be the case like 2 or 3 years down the line when a mid-generation refresh will come along. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. Thoughts on HDR, Tom?
Well, speaking more generally on the screen, but HDR as well, I thought it honestly looked like beautiful. My first impression of it was looking directly on, because obviously the camera footage we've got was we had to conform to Nintendo's guidelines on camera footage, which is historically always demanded that we have it over the shoulder, which is a bit of a nightmare for us doing this sort of shot with all three. But I think in some of the shots we did get, it did at least show off that actually the viewing angles on the Switch 2 screen were pretty good.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And this is a vibrant, bright screen, not as bright as the SWOLED, but it is, it has good contrast, enough to make the HDR10 effect pop in Cyberpunk. And even in Breath of the Wild, which is the test we did for that 3-way split comparison between Switches, you have that run through the first shrine, emerging out to the open lands of Hyrule, and that kind of contrast between the bright light at the end of the tunnel and the darkness of the shrine does show off the contrast of that screen. So I was impressed. I'm acclimatized to the OLED for sure at this point, but this, having put a pre-order in for the Switch 2, I wasn't disappointed.
Okay, that's fair enough, isn't it? Okay, I think we should move on from talking about the hardware and start talking about the games. And obviously this is going to be interesting because this is hands-on versus the kind of pure analytical coverage we've done off footage so far. Mm-hmm. Once we went through the queue into the main hall, there was kind of like a section apart from the main hall before you went in there, which was pure Mario Kart. You enter the room, we went in batches, and everybody got a round of applause simply for turning up, which I think is a first in 35 years of games journalism. But
Yeah.
that was fun. And then, yes, hands-on with Mario Kart World. And obviously, I guess, Oliver, you can give us a recap of the technical side of things, because you've looked at more footage of the game than all of us, I think, at this point. But I'm just going to share my impressions of it, which is to say that if you want a game that's going to sell Switch 2, this is it. Point blank, this is a work of genius, sublime genius, I'd say.
Wow.
It's just, I mean, what can I say? I mean, this is pure Nintendo. This is why you buy the games. This is why you buy a Nintendo system. You can't get these games anywhere else. That's the bottom line. Oozes charm, oozes polish, oozes just everything in terms of just the fine little details. So obviously you've got the Mario Kart core gameplay loop, which is just as good as it ever was, right? Arguably better, because there's going to be a lot of new mechanics in there. The extent of those new mechanics, we don't really know, because the actual content that we saw was very much curated. We had a Grand Prix race to test in that opening hall, and not much else. I mean, we could play it on handheld. We could play it on split screen, but two-way split screen. But ultimately, it was just like, okay, here's a Grand Prix race. But, what can I say? The attention to detail throughout in seemingly every little single moment of gameplay, quality of the visuals, is just astonishing. I just think it was superb. I can't wait to actually see the actual game, because we saw so little of it. That's kind of like a bit of the frustration for me. You had this hands-on opportunity, but your actual experience of what you played was considerably less than like watching the Treehouse footage. But ultimately, what you got was confirmation that Nintendo hasn't lost it. The gameplay was just pitch perfect. It just felt great. Tom, you were there too. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, they gave us a small handful of tracks to test out, and it was like one of the lower speed settings, 100cc. All the assists were on, which was a bit of a shame.
Yes.
Like auto steering and auto accelerate. It was just kind of like, oh, come on, give me something here. I can imagine, like, because there's 24, races on the cart at this point. That's a good way to wean people into the experience. What is it now? A very chaotic experience. And also to factor in the fact that there are new mechanics, like the wall jump mechanic and the grinding as well, which, you need a bit of time to get used to those. So it was a good demo for what that was. I mean, in terms of the visual side, it is gorgeous. It genuinely looks incredible. I think it's been a 2 generations since the Mario Kart 8. It was a Wii U game after all. 2014. So that was amazing. Ahead of its time visually for what it was as well. But it's a kind of a relief to finally see this next gen upgrade to that after all these years, best part of a decade. And, the texture quality, materials, the way everything's, all these models, especially when you see them on the character select screen. I don't think I've seen this roster look so sublimely detailed. Like, it's a little bit more in line stylistically with the Mario movie, I'd say. I don't know if you guys share that opinion as well, but yeah, it does have that kind of aesthetic, but it's just gorgeous. Like, everything about the game was so polished, and looking for any blemish, I think the reflections were the only thing. Like, some of the reflections during the panning shots on the title screen, you could see that there was like a slow uptick, maybe one in every 4 frames of the 60 FPS was it was updating, but that's really nitpicking. It's whatever resolution it's running at. I believe 1440p was our last pixel test. There was no sign of any aliasing. The anti-aliasing is very good, and I think they did a very good job in like presenting, the frame.
Does it have anti-aliasing, Oliver? I didn't think it did.
It doesn't have TAA for sure, unless it's very low quality TAA. It might have some post AA in there. And in general, they've kind of rounded things off to make it, I think, look not too conspicuous. I think it looks fine, generally speaking.
Yeah.
Okay. Oliver, curious what you think about this, because obviously you have done all of the technical work on all of the footage seen to date. I guess 1440p 60 is confirmed, right? Certainly
correct.
in that docked mode. Yeah. There is a 120 hertz mode, I understand. We did actually get to play the handheld version as well. It did look super, super crisp. I wouldn't be surprised if it is 1080p 60 on there. Curious to see if they do actually have some sort of 120 hertz mode in handheld as well. But, what can I say? This was the game that was built for Switch 2, literally. I mean, and it just shines on that hardware. Really shows what can be done with what is, ultimately a relatively necessarily constrained piece of hardware design. They've got to make this thing work as a handheld and, build a game for that system and exclusively for that system. And you obviously will get some outstanding results. I don't know if you've got anything more to add to that, Oliver.
Yeah, I think the quality of the art in the Mario Kart games and the craft they build into those courses is really extraordinary here. And obviously you're seeing that in Mario Kart World being brought into a huge, gigantic open world, which is a super intriguing concept. There's a Mario Kart Direct that's coming out this Thursday on the 17th, tomorrow, which should show off more of that open world gameplay. But here, yeah, it's definitely that kind of track-based experience and that kind of elimination mode experience as well in the Knockout Tour. They always do really high quality stuff with these Mario Kart games. And in particular, like Tom mentioned, they've adopted that kind of imagination, CGI kind of look to the characters. They've changed some of the designs around. Also, the characters are much more expressive during gameplay than they were in Mario Kart 8. If you go back to Mario Kart 8 replays, the expressions in the characters are relatively static. They're kind of looking a little bit tough. They're smiling, they're doing these kinds of things, but they look a little bit stiff. And the movements of the carts as well, it's not like a physics-based movement. Sometimes it looks very canned. Here, it feels much more like the physical movement of the cart feels much more physics-based, especially when you get hit. And the expressions in the characters are much more vibrant and lifelike, and you get that squash and stretch animation on the vehicles. The vehicles themselves are moving around a little bit. They're not so rigid. Obviously, this looks quite bright and smooth and a high frame rate. We've looked at this in some detail, but kind of just to go over some of the basics here. Yeah, there's a lot of baked lighting in there, like Mario Kart 8. There's some improvements to the water rendering, though. It looks like there might be planar reflections in the mix there on the water surfaces. Obviously, you're driving on top of the water instead of underneath it, so that reflection handling is quite critical here. You have, I think, overall better texture work, better materials. It's obviously running at a higher resolution, and it has a much broader scope. That's obviously quite critical. But I think one interesting aspect of this is that Engadget reported that it did have a 120 FPS mode, but Nintendo came out and said recently that it would run at 1440p 60 and 1080p 60. Well, Nintendo didn't say only 1440p 60 and only 1080p 60, but they did say those were the two modes available in this particular title. So that's not totally clear. I'd be ecstatic if there was a 120 FPS mode, but I'd also understand if that's pushing the system a little bit too hard, especially considering, you're looking at 24 player race events, massive open world, tons of stuff going on, presumably some even, dare I say it, Forza Horizon style events, possibly in that open world. Nintendo's certainly teasing a lot there. This could be a really demanding game to run, and it could be a very beautiful game, I imagine, the finished product.
Yeah, I think if there is going to be a limiting factor to 120 FPS, it's going to be CPU, based on everything that's going on there. The concept of streaming an open world, 24 players, that's a lot to be processing. So if it is 120 hertz, happy days. If not, then I don't see any problem with the 60 based on what I've seen so far. But obviously what we have seen has been curated, and we haven't seen the open world. But, based on the Treehouse footage and other stuff, it's just looking super, super solid. I just think, just going back to the busyness of the game, there's always so much going on screen, always these tiny little touches that, just leap out and grab your attention. It really is, as I said, sublime. I think it's, based on what I've seen so far, a work of genius, but perfect launch game, perfect system seller based on what I've seen. But obviously, what I have seen has just been based on like 20 minutes worth of gameplay, but it certainly makes a mega strong impression. Okay, let's move on. Metroid Prime 4. Now, this one is obviously interesting because it's a Switch 2 version of a Switch 1 game that's been in development for some time. And, we know the headline figures, right? It's going to be running at 4K 60 frames per second. And there is a 1080p 120 FPS mode. And there's been some sort of conjecture online rather about the Switch 2's capabilities. 4K 60. Wow, this is the sort of stuff that PS5 and Series X is doing. And 1080p 120. Ditto. I think the thing we need to bear in mind here is that this is a Switch 2 port of a Switch 1 game, and not just a Switch 1 game, but a Switch 1 game that looks so good that people kept asking us if it's running on Switch 2 when it was running at 900p 60. So the concept of the Switch 2 version providing like a 5 times increase in resolution while maintaining the same frame rate isn't beyond the realms of possibility, judged by the generational leap from Switch 1 to Switch 2. So I think that's worth bearing in mind, that this is ultimately a Switch 2 version of a Switch 1 game. Now, that's not to say that you still can't have superb artistic design that looks great at higher resolutions. And that's exactly what you're kind of seeing here. But Tom, you went hands-on with this one. And what's interesting about that is that the presentation that we saw was not the 4K 60 experience. It was the 1080p 120 experience, and also with an interesting twist on the control method, right?
Yeah, the first shot at having 120 FPS gameplay and also Joy-Con mouse controls as well, which they really encouraged to give us a go. And there's a couple of things on that. I mean, obviously, in terms of the pure visual side, it does look like it has roots in Switch 1 development, but it does look great for what it is, especially running at 120 frames per second. And on the screen we had, it looked absolutely buttery smooth at 120. I didn't notice any drops. The resolution side, you mentioned it's running at 1080p. That would be, I think at best the output resolution, right? Based on the HDMI spec. And that, going over the footage we kind of took, it's obvious that, just reminding myself of what I saw, there is some aliasing in view, even stood still, like, waiting to go to the next place, just stood still, figuring out what to do. You can kind of see some shimmer, some pixel crawl on some edges. So I'm not, so anti-aliasing might be a bit lacking there, but otherwise it was a really good sort of bite-sized demo that ended with a big kind of boss fight, and that's where the Joy-Con mouse controls really kind of shone. So it kind of works like this. You have the gamepad controls, you kind of start with the gamepad controls, and there's all the buttons to go into the morph ball, and much of the layout you recognize is still the same. But if you want to, at any point, you can take the right Switch Joy-Con, plant it side on the table, and start using it as a mouse. You obviously wrap your index and middle finger around the top, just as you would with a mouse, to hit the 2 trigger buttons, and you get your 2 fire modes from that, like regular fire and missiles. It works well. And I did find that there's an accuracy to doing it that felt akin to playing on PC, but it did feel like something was not quite there. Like it is sharper, more precise, but it also felt like your positioning ergonomically was a little bit awkward. And I think others have mentioned this. I think there's an article on Eurogamer about this as well. But you've still got to use your thumb to hit the face buttons to, change to the morph ball. So you've got to constantly, one option is to constantly switch between that position on the with the mouse kind of side on and raising it up to use it as a regular control. Or you can keep it down and just adapt your hand and adopt a kind of claw to always hit all those buttons. So it felt like a little bit of sort of finger gymnastics, if you like, to get everything, hit all the buttons you want to do. But I'm sure with time and practice, people will get used to that one way or the other. It's just something that kind of struck me as a bit of something to adjust to. The other thing I did try, just for curiosity, they had a table, obviously, but not everyone's going to have that luxury while at their playing position, right? Some of us are just going to maybe resort to using our knee or jeans or whatever. I did give it a go, and it is doable, but there's not enough travel as you might imagine for a sort of first-person shooter to kind of constantly do it, move the screen around and do a full 360. The upside is there are sensitivity controls in the Metroid Prime 4 menus to kind of bump that up, so it might be a bit better that way if you bump it up, and I did resort to that. But yeah, as is, you're just going to need a table to make the most of the mouse controls. And the final point is I did notice, I think you spotted this too, Rich, a little bit of lag in the controls while moving around. It might be down to the TV setup. I'm not sure, but it's just a smidgen more than I might expect from a PC style first person shooter with a mouse. But otherwise, I was very, very impressed. As kind of a proof of concept, this was the perfect game to use this with. There's one other game which we'll get to later, but this was the big one for proving the innovations of the Joy-Cons this time around.
Interesting. I did notice just by watching the movement of your hand and the response on screen that there did seem to be some latency there. I mean, realistically, it's most likely a display issue. However, it's quite funny that we were actually approached by quite a few of the Nintendo of Europe guys during the event there. It's really nice to meet them and talk about the system and to catch up and whatnot. But one of the guys was the guy who actually sets up the screens.
Yeah.
And I think I think he was telling us that John noted something off with one of the displays at an event he went to, and since then they basically calibrate all of the displays before an event, and they had to go in and recalibrate and reset rather the screens for Cyberpunk 2077 because somehow they'd switched to store mode. Where that was the main issue we had with Cyberpunk to begin with, where basically you could tell that motion smoothing was on because the quality mode at 30 FPS was displaying at 60, and there was huge artifacting around text and massive stylization issues. So on the one hand, it did look a little bit laggy, and I noticed that you were changing the sensitivity of the controls based off that. And it did look a lot better once you actually changed that sensitivity. But on the other hand, is it a display issue? Well, Nintendo are really on it with displays there. So we'll have to just wait and see once we go hands-on with the unit ourselves. But certainly in performance terms, it just looked buttery smooth to use the tried and tested cliche. Oliver, you looked at this footage.
I did, although I have very limited footage of actually Metroid Prime 4. I have a lot of footage of Tom's hands, so I get a pretty good impression of the mouse and behavior in this game. I guess comfort will be one issue that comes to mind here, just in terms of that kind of claw grip. It's nice that you can transition. Grip. Yeah, it's a very kind of claw grip.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, actually. Yeah.
I like that you can transition between the mouse and the Joy-Con kind of analog thing seamlessly. I think that's cool. But I also wouldn't mind maybe a kind of mouse shell attachment for the Joy-Con, maybe produced by some third party that basically turns that into like more of a mouse, an actual mouse that you can kind of grip like this, rather than just a kind of claw-like slab of kind of sushi like that shape is there. We also do have, this is not maybe pertinent to the hands-on stuff, but we do have some 120 hertz footage from Nintendo, some direct feed capture, which does look very good, but looking through it just now, there are some compromises. The fire animations are like flip books and they update at 30 FPS, 30 hertz, and the weapons fire from enemies updates at 60 hertz. Interestingly, if you slow it down, you can notice that.
Oh, interesting.
Maybe not too noticeable at 120 hertz in real life at real time, but if you slow it down, it's pretty easy to see. But it does look pretty good. But again, this is a game where 1080p, 120, 4K 60, what do you choose? The anti-aliasing, if it's present, does not look too great there at 1080p 120. So maybe go for the 4K experience, but again, losing out on that kind of nice temporal update there at 120 FPS is a bit of a downgrade there for sure. So picking what mode you go with here is going to be a little bit more difficult perhaps than with some other titles, I suspect.
Yeah, it's interesting, a point I'd like to pick up from Tom earlier about the actual output. we don't actually know what the output was, whether it was 1080p 120 or the system maximum, which I think is 1440p 120. You would obviously, if you could choose, have 1080p 120 because that should match the content and would avoid double scaling. But yeah, we don't know, because actually that was something which was a bit frustrating. I'd have really liked to have taken a good look at the display menus to see what was actually possible there, but you just couldn't. It was just you just locked out. Okay, let's move on to the next game. Obviously, the last big third-party Bananza was Donkey Kong Bananza. And we got to see I think it was about 20 minutes, wasn't it, Tom? 20 minutes of gameplay of that, where you could I guess it was starting the beginning of the game. This one is interesting. I think you summed it up best, Tom, when you said that, the people that have missed third-party first-party platform games from Nintendo are probably going to be really happy with this one. But I think it's probably going to be a bit more contentious compared to the other titles we saw. I played it for a little while, and I thought the obviously the system whereby you can just punch in any direction and just deform the environments in that kind of Red Faction guerrilla way, to coin a phrase, was really cool. Thought it was a really interesting mechanic. I'm not entirely in love with the art direction, with the art style. Didn't feel quite Nintendo to me for some reason. And there do seem to be some odd performance issues with it, because there is a hell of a lot going on. Once you're in full force punching the hell out of the scenery, there's a lot flying about. Tom, what do you think about this one?
Yeah, a lot hangs on that physics-based destruction mechanic, and you'd hope that translates going into this to some fun game ideas, and I think they've landed on an interesting sort of sandbox design. So to start from the beginning, we kind of began in the mines of Ingot Isle, and we're kind of in this cavern. You can pretty much smash in any direction. I agree that the kind of visuals are a bit sort of garish, but the game language is pretty clear about which bits you can and cannot smash, which is good. I think that's always clear. Like the sort of dirt on the floor, there's always some raised sort of mulch and debris on that layer, which makes it clear, okay, this is smashable up to the point you get down and dig far enough down that it becomes hard rock. So that was interesting. The effect of picking up chunks of the floor and throwing it, or riding it like a board, or using it to protect yourself like a shield. Picking that rock up is a bit of a magic trick that's kind of hidden by smoke and mirrors. In this case, a lot of particles. I noticed going through frame by frame that, you pick it up and it's pretty much a sudden, one frame flip, and suddenly the geometry disappears from the floor and suddenly it's in your hand. But they mask all of that by just throwing a ton of particles for debris and everything around it. So it works really well. And Nintendo seem very proud of their particles in this game, because they are everywhere. Like, you name it, there's sparks, there's mud, there's bits of everything flying around, especially in that initial mine area, which makes it kind of almost overwhelming to look at when you first play it, because you're hitting these buttons to punch the environment, and then suddenly everything's the screen is filled with so much energy. So yeah, on the surface, it's very glossy, very exciting, and absolutely something that the original Switch could not have achieved, like on the CPU that it's got. Whether I had fun, I'm not 100% sure. I'm not sure this is the game for me. Platform fans, 3D platform fans, Banjo-Kazooie, the original Donkey Kong 64, will be right at home, I think, in some respects. I'm not sold 100% that the physics-based destruction, the sandbox stuff is gonna gel with everybody, but I think it's an interesting take on the experience. The frame rate side of things is interesting too, right? Because I played this and I was thinking, this feels smooth. I think this is smooth. And I got back and checked the footage, and it was 60. Like the camera moves at 60, Donkey Kong moves at 60, but there's something bugging. I think you mentioned this as well, Rich. Something that was bugging us, that it didn't look 100% 60, and it turns out that some elements on screen, like notably physics-based stuff, like in one moment when you kicked smashed a fence across the screen and a barrel, the physics-based interactions past a certain point in the distance seem to drop frame rate out of sync with the rest of the screen. So that, the fences start running at like 40 FPS or so. And that's, I think, where the kind of disconnect comes from. I think we saw some frame rate drops. And it's why it won't pick up on our, on tools, for example, our frame rate reading tools. So that was interesting. And there were actual genuine drops as well. In two places, there's a interesting 3D map view. When you get out of the mines, you go to this sort of open world terrain in bright daylight, and you're pretty much free to go in any direction, pick up objectives as you choose. The 3D map strips out all the foliage. It lowers the geo level, the texture quality, pretty much within a few frames. And Donkey Kong is obviously removed as well. But in that moment, the frame rate starts to lurch as well, down to 30 frames per second. And it flips between 30 and 60, depending on what your view is, which, that as ever suggests double buffer VSync is in play, which is a shame because flipping between 30 and 60 never looks or feels very good. In gameplay, though, that wasn't an issue. It was 60. Though I did notice I accidentally flipped this on, the photo mode. This actually resorts to that double buffer VSync 30-60 flip. There are frame rate drops more so in the photo mode, which, if you're interested in using that mode ever, suggests that they may be using higher settings there, higher resolution or visual settings. So,
there are some performance drops in the game and again, you do see the double buffer VSync come in, and it is very, very jarring. Yeah, there is a sort of double buffer VSync effect there where Kong is like jumping up and then punching down on a button, causes all manner of destruction to break loose, and you can move through that frame by frame, and it is indeed like 30 frames per second at that point. You can literally see the update. So it does seem that there are some performance drops within the game as well, but it just looks slightly odd, slightly overwhelming at times with the sheer amount of stuff that's going on. And also, I had some camera issues with the sort of automatic camera shifting. So there's still work to be done on that one. I think it didn't quite have the charm and the instant appeal that I would expect from a first-party Nintendo title. But what I do like about it is that they're trying new things for a first-party Nintendo title. The destruction mechanic is a really cool idea. We haven't seen anything like it in games for a long, long time. So it's really nice to see all of that here as well. Is it too much for the Switch 2, or is it just we need to see an optimization push? I'm not sure. What do you think, Oliver?
Well, I hope it's not too much for Switch 2. I mean, in a lot of respects, visually, this looks very similar to another game that I think a lot of commentators have noted, which is Super Mario Odyssey. It looks like it might be using the same engine to me. It looks very similar, especially the kind of tropical water stages in Super Mario Odyssey. There's a lot of visual similarities here. I think a lot of people suspected it might be a Nintendo EPD joint potentially here, which is their entertainment planning and development, I think, division within Nintendo. And they were responsible for Super Mario Odyssey. They're also responsible for a lot of Nintendo Switch software these days. And there were rumors they were working on a Donkey Kong game a number of years ago, I think about 3 or 4 years ago. So potentially that's the case here. I mean, I'd personally lean towards that being the case, but Nintendo, being Nintendo, is cagey in a way that almost suggests a third-party developer, where they're like, we're not going to talk about the studio. And usually when they say we're not going to talk about the studio, it means it's Grezzo, or it means it's some third-party firm, right? It means it's basically a second-party or third-party development within Nintendo there. But I think this looks pretty solid overall. It's experimental in terms of the gameplay, but I'm also very encouraged there are some hard limits on the destruction, because if you have no limits on the destruction, then all of a sudden you go from a platformer to like something very, very different. Like, I don't think you can have a platformer without establishing some very firm boundaries on what the player can and cannot do and defining that challenge for the player. Here it seems like they are doing that, even though they have this destructive element, which looks quite cool. But yeah, I'm excited to see this. I think the particles look cool. I think it might be a really fun kind of action platformer game. Hopefully they can iron out some of those performance issues. But yeah, I suspect like some of the physics stuff, switching, being decimated to lower rates at a distance, I think that'll probably be maintained for the final game. But hopefully some of those pure actual frame rate drops can be ironed out to some degree here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, decimating animation effectively is a time-honored way to save CPU time. May well be the case here. Okay, so that was Donkey Kong Bonanza. I guess next we should talk about, well, I didn't actually have the chance to play this one, but you did, Tom, although you were savagely curtailed by the time limit. The Nintendo Switch 2 Welcome Tour. Now, obviously, there has been a quite extensive 26-minute video from Nintendo itself, but you've been hands-on. You've done the legendary frame rate test contained therein. But give us an overview of what you saw and your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think they're very strict on the time limits on this one, to such a point that I got to the frame rate, the Digital Foundry game, as some people call it. You ask which frame rate the game's running at. A ball goes across the screen, football, basketball, what have you. And you've got to say which frame rate is it, 120, 30, 40 FPS. And I got about halfway through that, and then it said time up. And I was like, no. But I didn't want to go through all the other mini games to get back there. So that's all I saw of that. There was very basic stuff, though. Like, I mean, it's cool, but it really should be a packing game. There's no question. Like, there may be much more to it further beyond that. But in terms of the opening 10, 15 minutes, what I saw was like tech demo stuff, like really rudimentary stuff. Like, here's how the gyrometers of the Switch Joy-Cons work, and you just wave these two to make the balls inside two transparent wireframe maracas. The balls bounce around 5 times, and then it's like, you've done that, move on. One mini game that I did actually quite like, and that goes back to the mouse controls. This is the second mouse control game. Was you're guiding kind of a character through a bullet hell shooter, basically, using the mouse pointer. Quite fun. Like it's all these spike balls coming at you at speed. You've got to last as long as you can, and I mean, I defy anyone to play that and not say it's a good time. Like, it works. I wish that was a bit more fleshed out than just this one throwaway minigame level. But yeah, it was really basic. Like, they wanted to show off all the features of the Joy-Con first. You're kind of on the Joy-Con part of the stage as this mini avatar. And, so part of that, you check out the HD Rumble by moving a slider across the screen, and then you get to the peak vibration, and then you say, yep, that's the highest intensity. Well done. You've won that game. So yeah, very this is $10. I'm not sure. I'm just not sure. But it really should have been a packing game as a welcome to the Switch 2 experience. But yeah, that's all it is, really.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I just remember my first experience with the Oculus Quest, as it was called then. You had this whole excellent setup procedure, and then you had like mini games that introduce you to the features of the headset. And, nobody was charging for that, but it was a cool thing to have. I'm kind of feeling the same thing about this one. Oliver, obviously, I mean, pretty much that Treehouse footage shows the experience. It looks nice. There's some nice ideas in there, but ultimately it is what it is, really, isn't it?
As a collection of mini games that is like the player's first point of contact with the hardware and its key hardware features, from the refresh rate support to the controls, to the new haptics and things like this, I just feel like this has got to be a packing game. I mean, I think they should change their minds about this, especially since Sony, just this generation, right, kind of did their very first, to my knowledge, their very first like full retail little packing game experience that everyone gets with their new PlayStation 5 consoles, which is Astro's Playroom, which is kind of similar to this in that it's introducing features to you. But I think if you compare this to Astro's Playroom, a lot of players would say, give me Astro's Playroom, even though it's not very long, because that is a really nice, detailed and fun platformer to play here, whereas this feels much more like a pretty basic little demo to show you off various system features. So yeah, I wonder if ultimately this is going to be something that justifies its $10 price. But without playing it myself, I mean, you guys are the experts here. Tom has obviously played it, defining its value just through some of this footage. I mean, it doesn't look like much to me, but maybe it's fun in person.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so one of the games that Tom made a beeline for, Street Fighter 6. You're a big fan of Street Fighter 6, and everything we've seen of the port so far on Nintendo Switch 2 looks quite impressive, right? And as we move on to the third-party games, I guess we're seeing a shift in focus. Everything we've talked about thus far has been software that's been built for the ground up for the Nintendo Switch 2 by Nintendo. So you're kind of going to be automatically seeing the system at its very best. That kind of makes sense, right? It's the same with first-party software pretty much for any platform holder. Moving on to third-party, though, there's going to be a different focus. What we're going to be seeing are games that are designed, many of them were designed before they even had access to Switch 2 or even a notion of what Switch 2 would actually deliver in terms of its performance. So the approach for these games is going to be taking an existing piece of art and then converting it to work on a system which, arguably it was never designed for. Street Fighter, I'd say, is one of the games that you would expect to hold up for a number of reasons. Number one, it's cross-gen, right? So already there's scalability built into the design. It's designed to work across a whole bunch of different hardware. And I think that's the sort of key point that we've got to sort of factor in there. Secondly, with Street Fighter, well, the actual deployment of that game across systems like PS4, Xbox Series S, it was quite expertly done. So, the focus was that you would get 60 frames per second within those fights, pretty much no matter what. And I think that's the thing that ultimately we were looking at first, right, Tom? Or rather, you were, being the Street Fighter fan, is this a viable Street Fighter 6 experience? I only had a quick time to watch you playing it, but I'd say yes. What do you think?
Yes, yeah, 100%. This is interesting for a number of reasons. I got to go on the docked play only, and it's our first taste of an RE Engine title on Switch 2, which sets a precedent for what we'll hopefully see in, I'd hope we'd see other ports of Dragon's Dogma to the Resident Evil games down the line. But I thought this was a really good start. Like, it's 60 frames per second, which is what matters. That's the priority, and it absolutely hits that. I didn't see any drops whatsoever, barring one exception, which I'll get to in a second. The visual side is a real mixture, I think. Well, I think people have drawn comparisons to PS4 and Series S and wondering which side of that it falls on. And the footage that I saw, there's no question, it's more on the PS4 side in most areas, I'd say. 1080p native resolution based on the direct footage. Then there's stuff like the shadows, which have this dithering and flickering. Yeah, it's not a distraction, but if you're picking it apart, that does stick out, and it falls more in line with what PS4 is doing. Screen space reflections removed, just like on PS4. Series S has screen space reflections on the Genbu Temple stage. So stuff like that. And there was one other point, which is Series S has these incidental physics-based elements on the stage, like cherry blossoms on the Genbu Temple stage, which interact with the player's feet. They move and swirl around the action. That is disabled on the Switch 2 version that we tested at the demo. So it does veer much closer towards PS4 by disabling those things, running at 1080p. But with that said, it still looks very good. I really like the look of the game. It's even at the sort of basic settings that PS4 runs at, it's still a very appealing looking game. Runs at 60, with the exception of the sort of face-off screen when you select your characters. After you select your characters go to a kind of face-off, and you can contort their expressions and make them snarl and make ugly expressions at each other. And in that moment, it kind of drops frames quite obviously. I've kind of counted it at about 40 FPS going by eye. So, but it's not game breaking at all, and you really get a good sense of the detail on the characters' faces in that moment at least. So it's not an issue. I think the only other thing to note is some people, I think, have mentioned that Series S textures, well, Series S textures were quite low quality in the original analysis that I did, and some people have noticed that Switch 2's textures might be higher, and that's something that I'll be looking at in a future video, I think, maybe when the Switch 2 comes out. But yeah, for the most part, it steers towards PS4 settings.
Obviously, Oliver, you've done a lot of platform comparisons based on the available footage so far. Not so much on Street Fighter, though.
No.
It wasn't really so much in the Direct, really, was there?
No, there wasn't a whole lot to compare.
Curious what you think.
There wasn't a whole lot of footage for us to compare. There's only like a little bit of direct feed capture thus far. But I mean, I would concur with Tom's view here that it is more in that PS4 level, especially with the removal of stuff like screen space, reflections, and stuff like that. That's kind of indicative of the system falling behind its Series S counterpart there in terms of its visual fidelity. But it's also, I think it depends on your perspective, right? If you're looking at this game on Switch 1, I'm sure it would look pretty bad. Like when we're looking at a game like Mortal Kombat 1 on Switch 1, that's a title that's really badly decimated visually. It looks nothing like its home console counterparts. And here, this is actually comparing fairly well to a prominent home console version of this title, even if that is the PS4 version. And it still looks good. It still seems to run well, still seems to perform at a fairly high frame rate level. So I think that's all stuff that, in my mind, is actually pretty encouraging. And it's actually not a bad showing at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, my overall thoughts on the hardware side of things is that it is a successor to the original Switch. It has the sort of similar balance in terms of having to accommodate handheld play and at the same time, work on a home screen. And it's the kind of limitations are imposed by that design that won't be impacting something like an Xbox Series S. That's the bottom line. So, there are going to be differences. There are going to be restrictions. And, that's just the nature of the platform. The question is whether you're really having fun. And from my perspective, Switch 2 is delivering, really. I mean, you just have to accept that some games were not designed for the system, and there will be compromises in mind when you stack them up against other systems which aren't designed to be handhelds as well. I mean, this is self-evident, right? Okay, let's move on. Okay, so let's talk about Hogwarts Legacy, which is a hugely popular game and also a title that has scaled, well, from the Nintendo Switch up to, high-end PC, up to, PS5 Pro, pretty much everything. So obviously this is another interesting barometer of where the Nintendo Switch 2 is going to be sort of hanging in terms of the other systems. And again, I think this was the last game that we looked at, Tom, and you spent a good deal of time with it. And watching you play, my sense was that it was lacking some of the finery of the current generation versions, and at the same time, performance could be highly variable as well. It did seem to be targeting 30 frames per second, at least in the modes that we saw. I'm not sure if we could change modes, but I'm curious about your thoughts on this because you did spend a good little bit of time on it.
Yeah, it was at the tail end of the show, just before we were about to be booted out, I think. But it was worth checking because it is a very high-profile title, and the technology behind it is significant enough. This was docked play only, so we had it on the TV. In terms of the settings, I made a beeline towards the graphics settings, and we only had toggles for motion blur and depth of field there. Right. So none of the, was it 7 modes? On
5.
PS5? Yeah. 5, okay. So none of that. It's one way to play, and I think I'm happy with that. That's fine if they're optimizing for that. It was 30 FPS mostly. You start off it had us starting at sort of dusk outside Hogwarts itself, and the mission was to go into this sort of building with a kind of Colosseum-like fighting pit in the middle. There's a kind of creature in the middle that you've got to take down. Fairly straightforward, and I did notice a drop, if I was to nitpick, as you kind of look over into the pit. It was for sure dropping into the 20s there in the demo build anyway, but it was really solid outside of that. I managed to get some time on the broom flying across the skies towards Hogwarts, and it was a rock solid 30 there. So I'd imagine that's one of the more sort of taxing areas in terms of streaming environments quickly. So yeah, I think in terms of the visual limits, some pop in, notably shadow pop in on the trees as you fly through the sky was obvious. Nothing too glaring though, and also image quality. We pinned this at 720p on the direct footage, though there was a lot of different sort of styles of footage in that. I think 720p was the number that most consistently came up. And rather than translating to a lot of aliasing, this is more, I think the anti-aliasing method used here ends up producing a rather soft image overall. It's a little bit sort of smoothed and not very defined, but it's still very workable. Otherwise, it was what you'd expect of maybe a PS4 level experience.
Mm-hmm. Oliver, you must have some thoughts on this.
I do.
Here's the thing. Like, Hogwarts was a spectacular looking game when it first arrived, and then gradually we've seen it ported across to less and less capable systems, and it doesn't quite hit the same way as it did anymore. So I'm curious what you make of this.
Yeah, I think to me, again, I'd go back to Switch 1 because this game had a brutal Switch 1 version, in my opinion.
Yeah.
It had like stripped out baked lighting, massively cut back asset quality. It had totally remodeled outdoor environments with totally different geometry, much simpler water. And on top of that, it had added loading screens between virtually every single area. When you were moving between the open world and more constrained areas, you get like these long loading screens that could be like 25, 30 seconds. Pretty brutal stuff. It looked radically different. It played very different because of those loading screens. And it was just not a very appealing experience, especially in like Hogsmeade. That's kind of the classic stress test. It really did not run so well when you're flying around on your broomstick. Did not run so well there either. But to me, this looks much more at the level of the last gen console release, like in my own personal viewing here, in my analysis of the direct feed assets that we have. And that version had some substantial downgrades. Like, the game, I think, is built probably primarily for current gen consoles, scaled back somewhat with last gen consoles in mind, and then scaled back much, much further on the original Switch. But I also suspect this game might have less loading issues maybe than last gen consoles, because the last gen consoles versions did have some loading screens between between Hogwarts and the open world, right? Because they say on the Nintendo Store description here that they've updated the game with seamless map load times for Nintendo Switch 2. So that sounds like it might have the really open world, no loading time experience that we saw on the PlayStation 5 consoles and the Xbox Series consoles. My only concern in the footage that I have is performance, which is a little bit shaky in the content that I've seen here. And that's a little bit worrying because, like, Hogsmeade Traversal is more demanding than some of the footage we have here, which is like indoor segments, open world segments without too much traversal. That's certainly a concern. They've got some time, obviously. But also, I would say here that the last gen version didn't run too well the last time we looked at it. Like, it was running, in the mid-20s, more demanding content on the Xbox One XS version. So it could well just be the case that this game is going to end up being demanding on anything less than a current gen console with a full fat Zen 2 CPU. It might just be a little bit too tough there for these weaker CPUs here. But I'd also note one last thing, which is that even though this game is available on Switch 1, this is not actually a Switch 2 edition. This is just a full-fat Switch 2 title. So as far as I can tell, there's no easy way to upgrade your Switch 1 version of this title to the Switch 2 version if you already have that Switch 1 version. Unlike the Switch 2 edition titles, which variously, you can get that upgrade with a Nintendo Switch Online membership, or you can maybe pay $10, I think is the asking price for the upgrade fee there. So in this case, that is a bit of a downer. I'd like it if there was an upgrade fee available there. But in this case, it's such a fundamentally different approach to Hogwarts Legacy that I can see them offering this for full price and that being justified.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of the Nintendo titles that have Switch 2 editions, one can imagine that, it's a fairly straightforward port, right? However, when you're dealing with something like Hogwarts, it's probably an entirely fresh port from the ground up. I don't think there's much relation to the original Switch version. I guess we'll wait and see when we actually review the game. Ultimately, it's going to be really interesting to see where it all fits in with the existing versions of the game. I mean, it looked fine, but it just seemed to, from my perspective, lack the wow factor that the original had. In terms of that anti-aliasing you were talking about, I think we established, Oliver, that it was 720p, therefore lower resolution than the PS4 version, but detail level was seemingly better thanks to TAA upscaling.
Possibly, yeah, some change in the anti-aliasing. It did look like, although this is just on the press asset, I don't know how the game actually looks in person here, but the original game used a combination of a 900p internal resolution on PS4 plus FSR1, and that with the TAA and Unreal just did not look very clean here. And the footage that we have supplied has a bit of a different character to the aliasing, has a bit of a different character to issues like disocclusion, looks a little bit more stable, more smooth. So potentially there's some difference there. But again, we'll have to see the final code to really say anything too dispositive about that.
Let's move on. Let's talk about the GameCube emulation. They had a whole rack of Switch 2s there that were running the GameCube titles. And that's quite fortunate, Tom, because you'd just done a video on the GameCube emulation based on the Nintendo Direct stuff. And is there anything you can really add to that? I think, I made a beeline to look at F-Zero. And the performance wasn't quite as good as GameCube based on what I saw, although it did seem to be content specific, right?
Yeah, we were expecting a smooth 60 based on the Nintendo Treehouse footage. Just going through that frame by frame, that was looking pretty positive. But yeah, you're right. Actually, in the heat of the moment, I was playing, and I didn't notice too much of an issue. But you pointed out afterwards, hey, there were frame rate drops. So I looped back, and then I started spotting, oh yeah, actually in the flyovers of every stage just before you start, there are drops. And at the sort of cockpit start, with all 30 racers in front of you, there are drops. And I did some testing again. I just went through frame by frame through our footage, and I noticed that it drops 1 in every 6 frames. So to put that at about 50 FPS, which felt
hold on a minute.
strange.
You don't think they were running the PAL version, do you?
Oh my God, I don't know.
That's a possibility.
Oh my God.
An unwelcome one for sure.
Yeah, you might be onto something there. Actually, oh my God! But it's
that was just a big revelation, there, wasn't it, Tom?
Yeah, that sinking feeling where it can't be. Then it's Nintendo.
Yeah, we have been in this area before with Nintendo emulation, right, on the Virtual Console, where the 50 hertz version is inexplicably brought to the fore on a 60 hertz based system. Doesn't quite work. So maybe that's just the explanation for that then.
Because the Treehouse footage was perfect. I was kind of surprised to see that.
Okay, well, I think we might have got to the bottom of that one then, because if the Treehouse footage, well, I'm assuming those guys are in the USA, they would be using the NTSC version, one might imagine. So I hope we haven't got an issue there in terms of the age-old problem of running 50 hertz games within a 60 hertz container. But yeah, I mean, that was my only gripe, really.
Yeah, for sure. Wind Waker as well, I got to go on that, and that was 30. Like, it looked perfectly fine. And the frame pacing issues we spotted in the direct footage, I didn't notice any of that, which was really good news. I was just playing through. So it's either I got really lucky and there were no bouts of it within the play I had, or it's just it gone. So maybe it's just very infrequent. So there's good news there. I did get a chance to use the new GameCube control as well.
Oh, really?
Sort of the new add-on peripheral. Yeah, all the whole segment, the back compat segment of the demo area was equipped with the new GameCube controls. And yeah, it's nice to be reunited with that. And it's coming from doing that back compat video analysis, where I did actually dig out my old 20-year-old GameCube and all the controls. It did feel like quite a difference in some ways. Like these were fresh controls, and you really feel it. Like the analog sticks feel stiffer as they should. A new control would, and there's none of the sort of wearing down of all those parts. It feels completely fresh. So yeah, very excited to see that. And there's actually a new button added to the top left, the ZL button, to account for modern games if you need like two triggers on either side. Famously, the GameCube controller only had the Z trigger on the right hand, and the Z button rather, and then the two triggers. So that makes it compatible if you want to play modern games with it. But yeah, very glad that that's making a comeback.
Okay, cool. Let's move on to final thoughts. Obviously, Tom, we've spent 4 hours with the Nintendo Switch 2. I'm curious where you think this lands. I'll tell you where I am with it. First of all, in terms of the success of the system, I think we're in safe hands here. I'm just going to say it again, Mario Kart World really is just a system seller. It's a game I want to play. It just perfect execution based on what I saw. Brilliant as handheld. Looks great on a 4K screen. And what can I say? I'm hugely excited to playing it. And the Nintendo stuff again, games built for that specific hardware, you can just achieve magic, and especially when you're sort of scaling up stuff from Switch 1. I mean, the Metroid Prime demo was great. I mean, it's a game that I want to play, right? Donkey Kong, I can't say I'm hugely enthusiastic about it, but I think it's going to find a following. I mean, literally, I've played only, 10 minutes of it or so, but it didn't quite grab me in the same way as the other games. But, I think it's going to find an audience, and I think it's really nice to see Nintendo doing new things with their new system. I think that's really, really nice. Obviously, though, when we move on to the third-party side of things, it's a different situation, right? We've got developers that may be new to the system that haven't had as much exposure to the hardware as Nintendo's own, and they're having to port across sister games which were designed for other systems effectively. I think the thing that I'd like to get across is what is the number one thing that kind of frustrated me with the original Switch? And it is the fact that I used it only as a handheld system because the docked presentation in most games just wasn't really good enough. It looked poor, even though we're still running at the 1080p style presentations. It works fine on a big screen. Not spectacular, but based on typical viewing distances, everything I saw looked fine. And yeah, so ultimately that's basically where things have kind of landed, exactly in line with expectations, pretty much in line with what we expected from the system. I am hoping to see more of Cyberpunk and to see improvements there, because there were frame rate issues that were particularly profound in some of the areas where we kind of expect. It's too early to have like an outline of system capabilities on Switch 2. But looking at Cyberpunk, it's really easy to test the stuff where you would expect to find system limits. Traversal. I mean, even on Xbox Series X, S, and PS5, the 60 FPS performance modes can drop frames when you're doing traversal. Switch 2 does it at 30. I was just actually looking at some of our old Cyberpunk footage, Tom, specifically your last gen coverage.
Oh yeah,
and it's like you've got a battery of tests that just shows stuff like CPU limits. Having a big fight in the open world with a whole bunch of entities causes frame rate drops, and it's exactly here. And yeah, I was really surprised to see that they were targeting the Phantom Liberty content for the demo. I guess it is, some of the most graphically intensive and impressive areas of Cyberpunk 2077 as a whole. But right now, it really does cause some significant performance drops there. But I did have a quick look at the earlier version, at the earlier content from the beginning of the first game. It seemed to hold up a bit better. Similarly with indoor stuff, like when you're on a mission, for example, that's within a contained area, that seemed to run a whole lot better. A lot of work to do there, though, I suspect. But I'm really interested to see where it ends up. So yeah, I mean, Switch 2, I think it's in a really good place. The hardware is excellent. The first party stuff is looking really, really promising to absolutely amazing. I'm keeping my pre-orders open. Let's just say that for sure. Third-party stuff, I think that's going to be evolving along the way as people get more au fait with the system, similar to what we saw in the past, right? I think, the concept of the impossible port hasn't gone away, but I think there's going to be some sort of hard set limitations on certain current-gen games that may not make the transition. But I do think we're going to be seeing a lot of last-gen ports and a lot of cross-gen games because it just kind of makes sense. Not sure we'll see Dragon's Dogma, though, there, Tom. That one is so CPU-heavy. I'm kind of curious if the Switch 2 can actually handle that. But certainly, stuff like Resident Evil, I'd expect to see.
Yeah.
It all sort of makes sense from that perspective. I'm curious where you land on this, Tom, because, I mean, from my perspective, it is indeed Switch 2. It is a sequel, same strengths and weaknesses, but moved on a generation. And curious where you land on this.
Yeah, 100%. It is a much needed iteration hardware-wise, rather than a massive innovation, which is, being something we've expected from Nintendo with every generation, some sort of quirk or novelty. And we anticipated something from Switch 2. And we got that in a small amount with the mouse controls. Honestly, going into this, and I'm sure many people going into this demo exhibition had the same idea, is what we're about to see going to justify my pre-order, the money I put down ahead of time? And for me, I 100% agree, it is Mario Kart World. Like, that is the game which stands above all the rest that I saw in terms of quality, in terms of the utilization of Switch 2, in terms of the visual quality of it. As secondary to that, I think there's games like Street Fighter 6, which I would say, is a game that I would genuinely play on the go as a portable experience. I'm excited to take that away and I find some value out of that. And the Cyberpunk side as well is obviously less polished in the build we saw. It's 7 weeks old, and there is time to polish it more by the time it releases. But based on what we're seeing, I was still really happy to see it there, and I thought it was a very audacious thing to have that.
Absolutely.
On
the
display.
Ambition there. I mean, first of all, kudos to CD Projekt Red for trying it, for putting the effort in.
100%.
Secondly, for showing it. Thirdly, for actually showing us really ambitious content within the game. Yeah. And I mean, basically, it sort of sets an expectation level. I do think it has been one of the most contentiously received demos, though, and I think they could have played it a little more safe in terms of just the PR side of things. But the Ambition, holy crap, I thought it was really, really impressive.
Yeah, and CDPR loved to do this. Like, remember Witcher 3 on Switch? I love an impossible port, and CDPR always loved to rise to that challenge. But I actually have a lot of faith in this one, that it'll turn out to be quite a decent experience, I think. I might live to eat those words, but I'm really, excited to see how that turns out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One thing I'd like to add is the concept of the Switch 2 edition. Going into the sort of Switch 2 period, my concern was that, the first party output could actually be significantly lower than it was before, specifically because they've kind of run out of games from prior platforms to bring to the Switch. And then, now we've got the Switch 2 editions. And, obviously, I don't think they're just going to be sitting still with these games. I mean, I'm just thinking about stuff like Super Mario Wonder, coming to Switch 2 with enhancements. I think that could be, really compelling for people to actually go back to the games that are in their library and play them with a fresh lick of paint and performance upgrades. I think that would be absolutely fantastic. But You weren't hands-on, Oliver, but I'm sure you've got a lot of thoughts on where things are sitting now with Switch 2.
No, I was not hands-on, unfortunately. But yeah, I think like the 10,000-foot view on this whole thing, at least to me, is that this was a showcase that was very heavy on last-gen software and cross-gen software. In here, I think in a lot of games where we see a Switch 2 version and a comparable last-gen console version, that it's kind of coming in at about that level, about that PS4 level, in that kind of in that kind of range there, in terms of that last-gen software, which is not surprising to me, although it's become more controversial over the past 2 weeks, but it's not surprising to me because that's what the simulations that Rich did told us roughly pre-reveal. That's what the hardware spec generally indicates. It's also in the ballpark of what you might think, given that the Switch 2 is using an 8nm process and it's using an older graphics architecture and things like this. So that's what things have been generally indicating. And in this showcase, that's also what the games have been indicating, like in Yakuza 0, which we did not talk about thus far, but we did test. It was developed as a cross-gen game for PS3 and PS4 systems, and on PS4 it ran at 1080p 60. On Switch 2 it also appears to run at 1080p 60, so we are kind of split on whether the asset from Sega was the correct asset or the asset from Nintendo was the correct asset in terms of its presentation. It does look like that asset from Nintendo is more reflective of the actual experience on Switch 2 hardware, and was probably the representative asset for Switch 2 hardware there, which again is no surprise. That's fine for cross-gen games. I think, to me, the key question that still remains about the Switch 2, and there aren't very many questions that remain because we know so much about the hardware, but the one key question that still remains is how do current gen games run in the system? Like, we've not seen a whole lot of that. We've seen Split Fiction, a couple of games, but no real demanding current gen games. I think the game that is probably going to come into focus there is the title like Star Wars Outlaws. And in that respect, you know, you can see a few things on Switch 2 that are maybe favorable, like the RAM allotment, like the storage, which is probably quite good, the decompression hardware. But on the GPU side and the CPU side, is it going to fare that well? Again, that remains to be seen. I hope that it will, but I suspect we're going to be seeing a lot of ports that are substantially downgraded on Switch 2 to a level where you'd probably prefer to play them on a home console system. But, you know, I hope that we do see a good result there in some of those more demanding titles. On the first-party side, though, I think there are a lot more positive signs. Mario Kart looks great. I think the Switch 2 editions look great. I think everything they've shown off looks pretty good. But of course, with Nintendo, they're building games up from the ground up for that system, so I always expected they'd do a good job. But here I'm kind of interested this generation to see if we see, like, you know, Nintendo titles that are embracing PBR materials, that are embracing TAA, that are embracing great GI, possibly DLSS, more sophisticated rendering features here. That's something that we're not seeing a great deal of so far. Again, very early days. But I could also see Nintendo going the route of saying, okay, we're going to emphasize higher resolutions, we're going to emphasize higher frame rates, we're going to kind of max out on our display support there, and we're not going to lean into too much into these really sophisticated rendering kind of pitfalls that have led developers to invest hundreds of millions of dollars into single titles. I could also see that being the case, or a mix of both approaches. But yeah, ultimately, I think we know a lot about the system. This only kind of confirms some of our suspicions about the system for the most part. There's still a few holes, though, in the system's library. Like, I'm really curious to see what Nintendo does outside of that launch window period, and outside of the Switch 2 edition titles. And I'm really curious to see what third parties do with really demanding software.
Absolutely, yeah. There's still a lot of question marks here. We'll start to get some answers once the system's out, obviously, and then the third-party rollout begins. I think on a sort of macro level, though, what sets Switch apart from prior Nintendo platforms, and ultimately it was that there was a huge amount of third-party support, and that was instrumental in that system being so successul. You know, the games don't need to look like the PlayStation 5 versions ultimately, because you're dealing with an entirely different proposition of hardware, really. And it's a proposition that not only worked, but produced, you know, an exceptionally successful generation for Nintendo. So, you know, the focus on the power narrative I'm finding kind of interesting, but ultimately it didn't really matter. And in actual fact, you know, we've actually done a couple of videos, Oliver, based on first and third party games, which were running on the original Switch, where, you know, obviously you hear the news at, you know, at launch, pre-launch, that it's running a Tegra X1. That's not a particularly great processor. Oh, it's running a downclocked Switch 1. Sorry, a downclocked Tegra X1. That's not particularly great news. And yet it's not as if we had any kind of problems with the quality of software across that generation. There were some absolutely incredible games. and we actually did videos on first and third party. And I think the bandwagon is just going to continue to roll into Switch 2. So the power narrative is almost kind of less relevant almost when you're dealing with a Switch style device. I mean, that's just basic, right? What can I say? Obviously, anything and everything Switch 2 that we can get our hands on at launch or pre-launch, we'll be there. I'd say overall, I came out of the presentation highly optimistic and obviously wanting one, which I think is the key metric there. So, yes, looking forward to seeing more. But that's it. That's the end of our hands-on special. So please do like, subscribe, share, or the off chance that you enjoyed it. Ring bells for notifications for you and potential algorithmic boosts for us. And yes, of course, DF supporter program. Join us. Early access to a bunch of material, early access and the chance to help shape DF Direct Weekly. Bonus materials, a whole bunch of stuff going on there. But that's all from us on this one. Thanks as ever for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.